Kevin, we'll give it a second here too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there'll be a little bit of delay. We'll get started at the top of the hour here. But it looks like people are now able to get into the room here. Yeah.
All right, you guys are live.
Thanks, Phil.
Yep, no problem. I'll be on mute. I'll still be here, but
Perfect. As everyone's coming in here, thanks everyone for joining. We'll get started here in about a couple minutes. All right, Kevin, I'm going to get everything situated here. I'll be right back, and then we'll get started here.
Great.
So, Kevin, while we're waiting and while people are watching, I had to go on mute for a second. So, because we are live streaming, there's like a 15-second delay, and Phil, who is producing all of this behind the scenes, is like a stone's throw away from me. I can hear myself talking like 30 seconds after I say it, and I had to go talk to him real quick to see if he can go and put his headphones in.
We're not having an Inception interview.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, it looks like about a minute past, so I'll go ahead and get started here. And as a reminder for anyone who joins throughout this whole process, so this whole interview, you'll be able to find this video after we're done recording. It'll be on the YouTube page, and I'll kind of give some details there. But then for those who are joining, they'll be able to live interact with us as we're having this discussion. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural webinar hosted by the Midwest Pediatric Device Consortium, or MPDC. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO of Project MedTech, and it's my distinct honor to be moderating this new webinar series on behalf of the MPDC. For those joining us live on YouTube, we encourage you to actively participate by submitting your questions in the chat at any time. This is intended to be an interactive webinar. I'll be monitoring the chat for comments and questions throughout the duration of the conversation here. Today marks the beginning of an important webinar series for the MPDC. Over the coming months, we'll be presenting a range of topics crucial to the advancement of pediatric medical devices. The dates of the future webinars can be found on the MPDC website at pedsinnovation.org, but they'll be May 14th, June 18th, July 8th, August 20th, and September 17th. So about one a month, generally right in the middle there of the month. Furthermore, we're pleased to announce an in-person showcase scheduled for July 9th in Cleveland, Ohio. Last year, we did that in Columbus. We'd love to see anyone who is passionate about pediatric device development join us for the opportunity to connect and collaborate in person. And it doesn't just have to be, Midwest or Ohio-focused folks. We had people from all over the U.S. attend last year, from Boston to Florida to California. The Midwest Pediatric Device Consortium, for those who aren't aware, is an FDA-funded initiative focused on advancing device development across the country. It's guided by the expertise and dedication of professionals from some of the leading pediatric medical institutions in the region, Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, which we're up in a little logo here today, Cincinnati Children's Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Cleveland Clinic Children's in Cleveland, Ohio. Their leadership is instrumental in the MPDC's mission to foster innovation and facilitate the development of much needed medical devices for our youngest patients. As a valued service, the MPDC facilitates informal discussions, which we'll talk about a little bit later, with the chief of pediatrics at the FDA. And this provides a unique and direct avenue to discuss regulatory strategies and the specific considerations pertinent to pediatric medical device applications. For those of you actively engaged in pediatric medical device innovation and seeking guidance on regulatory pathway or commercialization strategies, we encourage you to connect with the MPDC through their website. Again, pedsinnovation.org. They are valuable to discuss, they're available to discuss your concepts and explore potential pathways forward. To stay informed about future webinars, we invite you to subscribe to the MPDC's YouTube channel, which can be found by searching Peds Innovation. And now getting into today's webinar, the focus of today's webinar is navigating FDA changes and requirements for medical devices in pediatrics and understanding the impact of device type on FDA interactions. This is a dynamic area, and staying up to date on the latest regulatory nuances is paramount for successful pediatric device development. We're honored to host an expert in the field, Kevin Bossy, Head of Regulatory Affairs at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Kevin brings a wealth of experience and a deep understanding of the regulatory landscape for pediatric medical devices. Kevin and I had a preliminary discussion outlining the different areas we're going to focus on today. We intend to cover fundamental regulatory principles, distinctions between 510Ks, de novos, and PMAs, as well as strategic importance of engaging the FDA through pre-submission meetings. We'll also address specific challenges in navigating pediatric device regulations, such as unique considerations for biocompatibility, the increasing demand for robust clinical data, and furthermore, we'll be exploring the significance of software as a medical device and clinical decision support systems and how the nature of these technologies influence regulatory interactions. And we'll also chat a little bit more about the humanitarian device exemptions, HDEs, and also investigational device exemptions, IDEs. So it's my pleasure to formally introduce our guest today, Kevin Bossy. Kevin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
Yeah. So Kevin, let's start with a brief introduction to you and yourself and your background, because it's pretty unique. I mean, not only do you have device experience, but Nationwide is most certainly known for their gene therapy as well. And so just love to hear your background, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Great. So for me personally, I'm the director of the Office of Research Regulatory Affairs at Nationwide Children's Hospital. I'm PhD trained, did a research postdoc. I like to point out that I'm old enough to where back then doing anything other than research or teaching was an alternative career, and that was strange and weird. So of course I did a postdoc and realized in my postdoc that I do really have a true love for science, but wanted to do something other than lab bench research, and made my way into regulatory affairs. I joined the regulatory affairs team at Nationwide Children's really to specifically support cell therapy, and through then have branched out into all areas of regulatory affairs. So our office, our role really here is, we provide regulatory guidance, regulatory strategy. We communicate with the FDA. We maintain records. We do the submissions for our programs here at the hospital. But what I like to say is sort of broadly is we try to help our investigators navigate the complex process that is the FDA. So whatever they may need, regulatory strategy, IND, IDE filings, we're here to help get them through that. And this really was started a number of years ago with one of our first sort of main gene therapy programs, which became Zolgensma. So the first gene therapy approved for a pediatric indication in the US. That came out of Nationwide Children's. And a lot of times in most academic centers and places, regulatory affairs work, the FDA work is done by just the lab, by the PI, by the clinician, or maybe a person in their lab in their group who's focused on that. And what the leadership at NCH, who I give this credit to, realize is that there's a lot of hard learned and hard won lessons there about what works and what doesn't work when trying to deal with the FDA and interact with them. And so our office was formed to really be a centralized service for our investigators at the hospital. And so we support gene therapy, we support cell therapy, we support devices, we support software, new uses for approved drugs. Sometimes that is FDA regulated, and being at a pediatric hospital, that's more often than not, depending on what research questions you're asking. But we're here for anything FDA to really help try to just get those programs forward. Smooth the path, give you a roadmap, do something to get these things through the FDA, get that approval, get that acknowledgement, that activation, whatever you need to then get the program in the clinic, get it to patients.
Awesome. Yeah, Kevin. So I mean, fascinating background. Can you talk a little bit about, just for someone starting out, the fundamental difference between a 510K, a de novo, a PMA product, and
Sure.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful there.
In the medical device world, the FDA groups medical devices broadly by their risk category: class 1, class 2, class 3. Class 3 is highest risk, class 1 is lowest risk. And what you have to do to get approval to sell your device in the US, that depends on the class. So class 3, highest risk. This is life-supporting, life-sustaining, implantable device. That requires what would be a PMA, a pre-market authorization. So you would start by getting an IDE, an investigational device exemption, and I will throw an early apology out that the FDA loves acronyms, 3-letter acronyms. There's a million of them. Some of them are even longer than 3 letters, and they're like overly forced because the FDA loves them so much. So anyways, IDE, investigational device exemption, that allows you to do your clinical trial, that allows you to test your investigational device in humans. You do all your preclinical work, you do all of your clinical work, do your pivotal trial, you put this whole package together, you submit to the FDA for them to review and hopefully approve your device for sale. That's kind of the longest process, maybe the biggest process, and that's for those high-risk medical devices. Now, what if your device isn't as high of risk? So because of modernization acts that the FDA has done over the years, they've tried to streamline this process. And so one of the most common methods is the 510K, and that would be for something that's a lower risk. And what the 510K does is fairly interesting, is that you have a device and you need to find a predicate to that device. So you need to find another device that's currently being sold on the market that has the same labeled claims. And what your application to the FDA is really you're saying, okay, FDA, here's my device. You've already approved this other device, and my claims are the same as that device. Here, I'm going to show you that I know how to make it, and I can make it properly to the right controls. But since you already approved that other device, in the spirit of efficiency and modernization, you should just approve my device anyways. That's a 510K. You're saying that there's a predicate device, and since that's approved, here's all my controls and my design information and how I'm making it, and it's safe and everything. But then you should go ahead and approve mine too. And the FDA can approve on a 510K based on that. That's sort of one of the most common methods for regulatory approval. And then another method would be de novo. So not to get too in the weeds of the regulation, right? But if there is no predicate device, then the FDA would say, well, okay, since nothing else is out there like it, then it's going to be automatically class 3. But we know that's not really the case. If you're not making a life-supporting implantable device, it's really not class 3. So if you have a class 1 or class 2 device and there is no predicate, then that's when you file a de novo application. I'm wearing an Apple Watch. I like to use that as an example. The Apple Watch can measure heart rate, can measure your blood oxygen. It's a medical device. Now, Steve Jobs got up on stage and said, we had to file a de novo request because there's nothing else like this in the world, which is great, incredible marketing and advertising. But from a regulatory perspective, it's like, yes, that was the appropriate marketing application that you should have done for that. There was not a predicate device. That's what you do. So a de novo application is for something that isn't class 3, but you don't have a predicate for it. And that requires not as much information, not as much work per se, not as big as a PMA, but for a device that is lower risk, but there's not something else out there that's currently being sold where you can claim to as a predicate device.
Awesome. So I think the background's crucial, just because there are a lot of these terms that fly around, and I think a lot of times companies are affected by other people's knowledge of the regulatory industry in a way that, people say, oh, you should always avoid a de novo, always go after a 510K, oh, you're a PMA, that's really tough. And, these things are, those answers are not black and white. It's a heavy gray area.
Yeah.
And so understanding these different things are really interesting, the nuances, the different strategies of them. So it's important to level set. But let me ask you, with all of these, right, with the 3 we just described, they all carry a different level of information needed to achieve clearance or approval. Yeah. But there are ways to engage the FDA through pre-submission meetings. And that's a way to engage the FDA prior to doing any kind of formal submission. Why is it so crucial for companies to do this? Because we get this question all the time. I have very strong opinions about it, but I'd like you to take the idea of, hey, why engage the FDA early, and especially when you're talking about a pediatric device.
Yes.
Why do it? So what are the key benefits?
So we recommend a lot FDA meetings, and we recommend these a lot, not just for devices, but for our biologics as well. And my sort of broad thinking about this is number one, you get some answers. You hopefully will get something back from them. And we look at this as to say, this is an opportunity for us to give the FDA our plan. Here's what we're going to do. Here are our IND enabling toxicology studies. Here's how we're going to investigate this. Here's our clinical trial design. Does the agency agree that completion of this trial would be enough to support a marketing application? Does the agency agree that completion of this 12-animal, 24-week toxicology study would be enough to support a successful IND application? We really look at that as saying, here's what we're going to do. Do you agree? Now, a lot of times in these meetings, they say, we do not yet agree, and then you get a paragraph of things. And you have to go through and you have to pick out what they actually want you to do. But then, you have your marching orders. And a lot of times in the regulatory submissions, an IND, for example, there is a section in the CTD where you can put your pre-IND comments. So we ask the FDA a question, they give us an answer, and then we tell them, here's where we did that. Here's where you can find it in the submission. And, to me, I'm like, and then everybody's happy, right? Like, this is, we said what we wanted to do. Maybe you didn't agree. Maybe you wanted us to do a little different. And then we did that. And so here you go. Some groups don't like meetings because they add extra time. Depending on the kind of meeting, it could be a 30-day turnaround, a 60-day, a 90-day turnaround. If you build that into your regulatory strategy from the beginning, and you kind of have that at certain inflection points, maybe when you've got some data, maybe when you're about to sign a contract for a big contract research organization, if you build it into your time point, it's not going to slow you down because you know what's coming and you know what the turnaround is. Other groups tend to say, well, we'd rather just submit the regulatory filing and then see what the FDA says. Sometimes that's a business decision, because then you can say, hey, we submitted, and you can press release, and then maybe you can fundraise or get some stock price jump. But if the FDA doesn't like it, you're going to wait another 30 days after that submission for them to then tell you why they didn't like it. And from my perspective is, yeah, maybe sometimes they're going to give you a big laundry list of stuff to do, but maybe it was something small that had you known that 6 months ago, you could have just done it. And now we wouldn't have gotten a no, we wouldn't have been on hold. So I am a big supporter of FDA meetings. I tell people too, they're not required. You don't have to do one. You know, if you have a program that you've done a very similar one, you just did a similar one 9 months ago, and you're just kind of looking at a different indication. Well, maybe you don't need to do a meeting, but they're oftentimes a really good idea.
Yeah. I think, I've seen maybe a handful of devices go through without a pre-sub on their first submission, and all of them were special 510Ks where their predicate was the first generation of that company's product, right? And so it doesn't.
It's a little Control C, Control V there, and that's a little different than I would say typical application.
Yeah, it doesn't happen often. And this is why, like, if you go to the FDA website, you can see average turnaround time or average clearance time. And with let's just take 510Ks, for example. I was just looking at a product code yesterday, and the average clearance time was 272 days. Mm-hmm. And so that is from the time you do your first submission, which means they probably got 3 to 4 rounds of questions back, right? And so this is why this is important, is that's not from like the time you're like, oh, I'm going to start doing testing. That's the time from you submit your first 510K.
That's when it went in the E-Star. That's when you put a stamp on it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what that tells me in a lot of cases is, yeah, you probably can afford some time to engage with them up front, because in every pitch deck I've ever seen, everyone always has, oh, well, I'm submitting for 510K clearance this date, and then I'm going to have 510K clearance 2 months later, right?
It's possible.
It's possible, but if you didn't do your engagement up front, and then you have that 60 days turns into 270 days, investors are going to be more upset than if you just would have told them ahead of time, right? So anyways, I love your feedback there, Kevin. I think it's crucial. Okay, so regulating devices for children is a little more complex. What are some of the unique regulatory challenges that companies face in the pediatric space compared to adult devices?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because almost everything comes into the answer to this. So, when you're developing something, be it a device or a drug, but it's truly for a pediatric indication, the FDA is looking for data with your target patient population. If you ask any pediatrician, they're going to tell you that no, children are not just small adults. They work different. Everything about them is different, and the FDA sees it that way as well. So your clinical trial is going to be more complicated. It's going to take more time. Children cannot provide informed consent the same way that adults can. So there needs to be special precautions for them in these studies. It's going to take more time. It's going to take more money to get the same data. And that's data that FDA is looking for. They're not typically going to see that adult data and just say, oh yeah, 1-to-1 that works entirely. Another issue is that, again, if you're going after a true pediatric indication, that's a smaller number patient population. So a lot of times in the business world, that's seen as a niche market. So you have an overall program, development program, clinical trials, everything is going to cost more. You're then going to have a smaller market of which want to sell and distribute to. So that's kind of less. And then the other part that gets in there is that the FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine. There is off-label use, and that is allowed, and that is very common. A classic example is the tricyclic antidepressants, right? They are an antidepressant that also treats neuropathic pain, and that has now become widely established and widely used. It wasn't developed for neuropathic pain. It wasn't labeled for that, but it's used for that. that happens in pediatrics all the time. I mean, they use beta blockers for hemangiomas, I think, or other things like that, where things are used off-label. That also goes into the device world. So a group may be developing, manufacturing a device that's not labeled for pediatrics, but unless there's a specific black box warning, unless there's specific contraindications, unless there's dear doctor letters, they can use that for pediatrics. And oftentimes it works just fine. But again, it's sometimes it's more complicated than just, well, we'll make a smaller version. That's usually not enough. So the field of pediatric device development is unfortunately small and difficult. And there also are not many. There's not many tech incubators out there looking really to support this. Thankfully, what we're here because of today, there are some now, like the MPDC, but it's really, it's really a lot more compressed. Things take more time, things cost more money, markets overall smaller. It's, oftentimes easy enough to just grab an adult device off the shelf and use it anyways.
Yeah. Kevin, we got a question while we were chatting about previously, I think we run pre-subs, but it was from Brian Palmer, and he asked, how do you determine a product code and class for a new product? So I think this would be in relation to maybe de novos and PMAs. Yeah.
So a lot of times, it's a good question because you kind of have to do it yourself. And this is a good example of when pre-submission meetings can be useful. So you should, as between who is developing the device, who's the disease expert, all that sort of thing, through your thorough, which you should be doing, through your thorough risk analysis, you should be coming up with what you think the device class is. And this is one where you can go to the FDA with these meetings, and that can be one of your main discussion points about, does the agency agree with this? You can request specific device classification determination meetings. Those do have a cost associated with them if you are a private company, but you can set up a specific meeting where the only thing you want out of that is a letter from the FDA that says, here's your class. And so, if you think that there are, I'll say, pseudo predicates out there and similar things where you can feel pretty confident, you don't have to do that. But if you have questions and it's just really not clear, or you think the FDA is going to push in one direction and you really want to push in another direction, those are times where doing those meetings can be useful, where you can put all of your information out there, have your risk analysis, make a fully complete, scientifically backed argument, spelling it all out there for them, that they can hopefully in the end agree with.
Awesome. So we talked a little bit about what makes children's devices a little more complex. One of those areas I'd like to dive in a little bit more into, because this was an area. So the first 3 years I spent in the medical device space were all in biocompatibility, biological safety, which generally, when I speak to clients, I tell them this should be the last thing that you ever get hung up on, is biocompatibility. The standards it's not very clear, but it's pretty well developed. There's always changes and evolution to it. But I mean, really, what you're doing with biocompatibility is saying, hey, great, we're passing tests that show we don't have any local toxicological. We're passing local toxicological endpoints. We're also passing systemic toxicological endpoints. However, there is one area where we used to get, it was just significantly harder, was the systemic toxicological endpoints for pediatric devices, because of the weight of the patient population you're going into. Generally, they're smaller. And so can you just walk through maybe some of the specific considerations or hurdles that companies have to address, and how you work with that with the FDA, and maybe how this ties into pre-subs too, Kevin? Because I think that when I think of pediatric devices, it sounds like, hey, there might be a pre-sub for just biocomp. There might be a pre-sub for just preclinical testing. There might be a pre-sub for just clinical. And so I just maybe walk us through a little bit of that as well.
Yeah. It's interesting. You're the example you brought up about systemic effects and weights, That is true for biocompatibility of a physical device, and that's also true for cell therapy. For your non-target cells, or your T cell limit. If you say it's X number per kilogram, well, we're talking a small number of kilograms. That's a pretty low limit. Can you actually make your product within those type parameters? So this is one where, again, oftentimes the standards and regulations are written in a way that don't really consider pediatrics. There's ASTMs and there's the ISOs, and you can look them up and you pay the subscription fee and you get all the list. And then you find a contractor who can do all the tests, and they can do all the tests. And it seems pretty cut and dry. Like you said, it's not something you should most of the time get hung up on. We're making something out of plastic, and we're going to do our extractables and our leachables. And we're going to do our NMR and all this stuff. And it's all very well defined, and there's pages upon pages of how you should do it. But then you get the number and you do the math backwards and you realize you're way over the limit. And so those are sometimes some of the challenges that I think really you need to see those beforehand. You need to look out for those before you're designing these studies, because again, anybody in the world is happy to take your money and to do the studies if you can't do them yourself. Or maybe you got your army of grad students and they're going to work on this for months. Well, you don't want all that time to be wasted, right? And this is a great example of, like you said, where having a specific, and I'll even say meeting strategy with the FDA, where maybe it's not even just one meeting, it's more than one, that you can say, look, these standards are not congruent with the patients that we're going to be treating. And we need some sort of alternative way to be looking at this and making sure that you, FDA, are satisfied that this is safe and that we have robust, reliable scientific data. But we can't just send it off to an outside group and get results in 6 weeks the same way we normally would. And they say FDA, the reviewers are, they are people, they are other scientists. They are held to their grading rubric, right? They're held to their standards. They have a document. They're going to go side by side and check yours off. But rational, scientific-based designs for potentially alternative methods can sometimes be used in these circumstances. Or if they can't, if they're going to hold you to a standard that's really difficult to hit. Again, knowing that as early as possible, it might even change some of your product development to do that. The non-device example, right? In cell therapy, FDA is telling you, no, we want your T cells this low. That may change your even manufacturing steps very early on, that you're doing extra depletions, you're doing this and that, can completely change how you're going to make this product. But you got to know that ahead of time so that you can bake that into the early stages.
Yeah, I want to touch on a point you just brought up too about the FDA and them being human too. They're especially in like a segment like artificial intelligence or machine learning or software as a medical device as a whole. They're learning that space as well. And I think that's the important thing to keep in mind, that companies oftentimes maybe forget about when they're dealing with the FDA is, one, they're human, and two, their goal is to make sure that whatever they say, yep, we're good, you can sell this now, is safe and effective. That's what they're trying to do. And so if you can keep that frame of reference when you're engaging with them, and not that they're trying to prevent something from being on the market, you'll probably have more success with that. And generally, anytime I've talked to a company that starts off with, well, we're having trouble with the FDA, I always kind of go back and say, well, are you communicating with them well? Because generally that's where people fall short, is there. And very rarely is it because the FDA has some vendetta against that company, right? And so, we did get another question about, it was when we were talking about some of the challenges with regulated devices for children. And the question came from Bart, and it was, what about getting approval for 2-year-old plus to make it easier? So, maybe I'll expand. I'll take that question and expand a little bit. Is there a strategy to say, hey, let's go after, certain certain weights and above, or certain ages and above, and then slowly step your way down?
That can be a useful strategy, depending on what your device, what your program is. I'll say, in my personal experience, if you have a product you're developing and it affects ages 0 to adult, FDA is going to want you to do the adults first. Then they're going to want you to look at ages like 9 and above, because age 9 can provide assent for a clinical trial. Then they're going to let you start to look at younger patients. So there absolutely can be a strategy by which you are looking at a less risky, less vulnerable patient population first before expanding. That gets into all of the business side stuff, right? That can affect those decisions. But yes, older is less risk, and so there can be strategy pieces built into that as well.
Awesome. It seems like the FDA is increasingly looking for more clinical data, even for lower risk devices, and not just in the pediatric world, but as a whole. I look at things like wearables and software as a medical device. There's way more clinical validation studies than we've had previously. And I'll say this with the asterisk, I tell every company this, just because the FDA doesn't ask you for clinical data doesn't mean you should not be collecting clinical data. My goodness, there's clinical data will help with physician adoption, reimbursement, commercial strategy, marketing, all of those things. But as it relates to the FDA, can you just talk a little bit more about the trend and what companies should be prepared for?
Yeah, we're at a changing time in the FDA, in that I think certain things are going to get more stringent and certain things may get less stringent. One thing that we have seen across the board over the last decade is that the FDA is always asking for more. They're always raising the bar, moving the goalpost, or whatever sports analogy you want to use. And that's because of a point you brought up, that this is from what they are learning. And this is what I tell our investigators all the time when we're putting together our applications, is that FDA, they're the experts in the regulation. They should know the disease. They should know the kinds of products. But if it's really novel, first in human, and you're developing this, you know more about it than them, right? Since you're the one who made it up. So the field of science and the research is moving faster than what they can stay on top of and what they can regulate. So you need to make sure that you are explaining it to them in a way that they are understanding what they're getting into. As they learn more about it, then they learn more about what is important about it. What are the theoretical risks versus what are the real true risks? Or have we started seeing what was once thought to be a theoretical risk now to actually happen? We see the first instance of that. Okay, that means FDA is going to ask for more things surrounding that. They're going to want more information. They're going to want more things. So we've seen that as a broad trend in these fields, that as the FDA learns more, then they start asking for more. I think personally as well, I'll say that there's a lot of nuance, as you mentioned, to where in software, AI, clinical decision support, these sorts of things, there's a lot of health aids, a lot of things that are not medical devices. And so if you're going to say that you do have it is really actually a medical device, FDA is going to hold you to those standards. And as more of the other things come up, the standards for what are truly the medical device may also increase to ensure that yeah, they're doing what you say you want to do. The FDA, at its heart is a consumer protection agency, both safety and then against fraud. You can't sell something that you say it's going to cure a disease and it doesn't do it. And so I think that stringency is going to come along as these programs develop as well.
Yeah, 100%. Great point there too, because it's not just your product safety, it's the claims you want to make. That's a heavy piece of this. And so we did get a question about clinical data, so I'll ask that real quick as well. How does FDA value non-US data, and does it depend on where outside the US?
So Yes, it is. As I say, it's the most annoying answer in the universe. It depends. It really does depend. This is another area too where FDA has said, they have stated over the past few years that they want to start using more of that data, right? They want real world evidence. They want real world data. They want to include other data, other studies. The actual adoption of bringing that in and using it has been slower than what they've said they want to do. So for clinical data outside of the U.S., I think at the end of the day, it's how transparent and traceable is that data, because they are looking for robust, high quality data. Anybody who's worked at an academic center and has had to go through a sponsor audit or a pre-submission audit, and you see just how much they are looking at every detail of everything that was in that clinical trial. Are you able to provide them with that same level of data? Because if you're not, then they'll look at it and they'll consider it, but they're not going to give it the same weight as they would for a US produced, GCP audited, monitored, all that sort of thing, because that's what they want, because that shows that the data is of the utmost high quality. So it really depends on that quality of the data, where you're getting it from, how good is it, how traceable it is. But like I said too, FDA has said that they want to start using more of that data and being accepting to it. So hopefully as that kind of progresses, that can become more of a common use.
Yeah, and just to plug some of these future episodes real quick as well, I had to pull up the image real quick on my phone. The clinical evidence discussion, we're going to be having that in May. We have another discussion around more in depth on software as a medical device and securing coverage for that from reimbursement. And then we have a whole one on real world data. And so these are all key issues that are all intertwined. Speaking of software as a medical device, it's certainly becoming more prevalent. There are a number of different buzzwords that are flown around frequently. Software as a medical device, clinical decision support products that are non-device, clinical decision support products that are devices. There's some great information on the FDA's website on this, and so I would encourage folks to read through that. It's super easy to find if you just search software as a medical device. It has a nice little decision tree, but maybe just, Kevin, just kind of lay the land of what all this means, and how does it affect folks who are using software in their medical device, because this is we're not just talking about like a straight just only software as a medical device. Most products are starting to use software, so they're going to be affected by this as well.
Yes, and this is an example really where as well that the technology is moving faster than the regulation. And I will give the FDA credit in that they are trying to keep up, and they are putting out new guidances. They're trying to host town halls. They're trying to host meetings where experts are presenting to them so that they can learn. So a lot of it is changing, but software is a medical device, right? Diagnose, treat, cure, prevent, mitigate a disease in human. If your software is doing that, then it's regulated as a medical device. Now, this goes back to the device regs are written in the 70s, where if something used a program or a software, well, it was obviously attached to an instrument, so of course, therefore, it's a device. But there's a lot of nuance to it as well, right? If the software is like integral to the device, it's part of the hardware that is just making the device operate, it's not software as a medical device. If the software is, part of your phone app, and it's just a general wellness app, not a medical device. Software, if you're using it to help you manufacture a device, not a medical device. But certain other things that kind of go along with that are, if you are processing images which are then going to give a diagnosis, that can be a medical device. If you're tracking a heartbeat, not just because I want to know my heart rate on my watch, but because it wants to tell me that I have an arrhythmia or I am having heart attack risk or something like that. That can then be a medical device. Within all of this too, what the FDA is seeing a lot more of, what we're seeing a lot more of, is what's called the clinical decision support software, where this is software that's going to take information and it's going to process it in a way to then give to a healthcare provider to help them make a decision. So the CDS is such that it's not a medical device because it's not making a diagnosis. It's just providing the healthcare provider with more information to help them do what they're doing. That's very gray as well. That's very nuanced. There's 4 criteria you have to hit about not processing information, about supporting recommendation, not being of substantial importance for other things, and a lot of it goes into that as well, to make that not a medical device. AI, right? Everybody wants a GPT. Everybody wants to put information into a GPT and have it tell you what to do. That's changing as well. And one of the things I always point out is that a lot of times what the healthcare provider does with the information can change that. I say it magically. You can, because the healthcare provider, if they're using that for substantial importance to diagnose a disease, you have now magically made your software a medical device based off of their action and their behavior. So you got to be really careful as well in certain aspects of that, where what are they doing with that information? What is that? Is that the only test they're going to run? And then they're going to look at this risk score and say, okay, yep, you have this disease, and now we're putting you down this treatment plan. Yeah, that could be seen as a medical device, versus maybe they do it along with standard pathology and standard this and standard that, and then they look at it and it gives them an overall picture, and then that helps them decide on a treatment algorithm. Well, okay, then maybe that one little piece there, not a medical device. So yeah, so big gray area, lots of changes. FDA is putting out new guidances on AI as well and everything like that to try to stay ahead of it, because it is going to be utilized. It is going to be included. Everything that gets plugged into a wall is going to have software at some point along the way, and the FDA is going to be looking to regulate that as needed.
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of those areas, Kevin, where I think you can have such a deep conversation on, because it's for me, it reminds me of when the conversation first started on driverless cars, right?
Sure.
And it was mostly people just couldn't fathom not having control of an outcome, right? And so it's taken a long time, right? I mean, there are driverless cars on the road, but it's not like they're all over the place, right?
Right.
It's the same thing with medical devices. Is when the FDA, when you start to introduce a closed loop system where, hey, we're going to monitor. Like, I remember working on a product in a previous life where essentially it was going to monitor a patient under anesthesia, and instead of having the anesthesiologist determine when it would dump more medicine into the patient, the algorithm would do it itself, right? Hey, if it got out of this, then they would do that. And in the initial pig study, it was wildly better than a human doing it, because they were paying attention to data that just the human couldn't take in that much data. And so now the thing though is that will take forever to get to market, because there's that risk of, well, what happens because there's no human intervention now, right? So it's such an interesting conversation. I think it's part factual, it's part philosophical, right? Of like, how do we handle these things? But it's super interesting. It's for another podcast. Can you talk about the humanitarian device exemption, or HDEs? Because this is a really interesting piece, and I think it could be more applicable when you're thinking about pediatrics.
Yeah. So, so earlier we talked about there's 3 ways to get your product to market. Well, I lied, and there's actually a 4th. HUD, humanitarian use device. It's kind of like orphan, but for devices. And what that is a designation that you can get for your device if it is to treat a disease that affects fewer than 8,000 persons in the U.S. It used to be fewer than 4,000 per year. 21st Century Cures Act actually raised that to be 8,000. So it's not as ultra rare, it's still rare. But if you're making something to treat a rare disease, you can get this HUD status. Like I said, basically orphan for devices. What the FDA has allowed is that if your device is an HUD device, you can submit what's called a humanitarian device exemption, an HDE. The idea behind that is that that is a more streamlined path towards approval. The idea being that it's on a humanitarian basis. These are for small patient populations that might not have big markets to support them. So the FDA has this mechanism by which you can get approval to distribute your device on a smaller budget, if you will. The requirements for an HDE are that you have to show safety, you have to show the device is in the best interest of the patients, but you don't have to show efficacy in the same way that you would for a PMA. So you're really looking at this, and the FDA is really saying that we know it's safe. We think it'll help the patients. We think it's good for them. So we're going to let this go without full confirmed statistically significant efficacy data. And with that, you are allowed to charge a profit for it. There's caveats, because there's always caveats, and there's requirements, and you can't be excessive with it. But an approved HDE is a commercialized product by which you can sell and make a profit. Now, the kicker on that is you can only sell it to institutions that themselves have an IRB. The idea being that the IRB is going to review this program, this device, and determine whether or not they agree with the risk profile for their patients. It's through the IRB, but it's not a clinical protocol. It's not a trial. It's kind of like the FDA using local individual IRBs as surrogates for their big overall review. So yes, this is a great avenue for certain pediatric devices where it's going to be for a rare patient population, and this can allow you to get to market further. The next question everybody asks is, well, if I got an HDE, could I then get more data and go to a PMA? Yes, you can. A lot of groups, though, will tend to stay in that HDE world, because once you're able to do that, you are selling it. And that is, again, that's something that it's for rare diseases. It's not used as much as like the drug orphan program in my experience, but I think it can be a great option, especially in pediatrics.
Awesome. Kevin, we got a question from Rich Mazzola. When leveraging non-US vendors, is it important to validate with the FDA in a Q-Sub or other manner that test results from those vendors will be accepted by the FDA? Is there a pre-approved list? So maybe thinking more towards the lines of like biocompatibility testing and bench testing and other things like that.
In my specific experience, I have not seen the FDA having a problem with outside US testing, as long as it's done to the right standards and as long as the information that company provides, the FDA can validate it, right? If it's done with an appropriate quality system, and you can demonstrate that. In my personal experience, FDA has been accepting of that from outside the US. If we're getting into certain like critical quality attributes that we are going to be seen as very important, I think it's a great idea to validate those first with the FDA, and to, again, as I always do with my meetings with the FDA, here's what we're going to do. FDA, do you agree? I think that's a great option as well. There are a lot of nuances to outside of US products, outside of US data, how you import that product, how that product is labeled, how that needs to come in. Do they see that as itself a medical device, or do they see that as just a component in your medical device manufacturing, and then therefore how does it need to cross customs? These are good things that you can discuss in a meeting. So meeting's a great idea. Again, in my personal experience, I haven't seen significant problems with outside of US vendors, as long as the right documentation is in place that the FDA themselves can review.
Yeah, we my experience with this generally falls around biocomp. That seems to be a heavy area where people try to go do it for cheaper. My recommendation to everybody is always just pay for the testing. This is such a silly place to get caught up, and there are labs that will be investigated by the FDA. I saw it a lot where people went and did studies overseas in labs that were questionable. They got questionable results, and the FDA picked it apart and wouldn't accept it. And so you be careful, tread lightly with this, and if you're getting a better deal, there's probably something going on there.
Yeah. We had some data come through that was from Japan that FDA reviewed very favorably. I don't think that was any cheaper than what it would have been in the US, but just had to do with vendor relations, and that's fine. And they went that way, and the data was incredible, and FDA had no problem with it. But yes, if you're looking to save a little money and maybe get something done somewhere else, be cautious. And even still, this is just always a point of caution. Some of our, one of the largest contract labs that has facilities in the US but is foreign owned is now under investigation by the FDA. It's a lab that a lot of groups use, and so there's always, I'll always just try to think holistically about who you're getting your contracts through.
Yeah. So Kevin, last question. I teased this out earlier, but one of the benefits of the MPDC is the ability to have these informal discussions with the chief of pediatrics at the FDA. Can you just kind of walk me through a little bit what those meetings are, how you engage them, the benefits of that?
Sure. So, I mean, this is an incredible benefit of the MPDC through the grant that's provided by the FDA. All the meetings that we've been talking about, some of them are formal, where there will be formal meeting minutes. Some of them are informal, where there's not full meeting minutes. But a lot of times in those, the FDA, they just want to give you written feedback. You give them data, you ask a lot of questions, and they just want to give you a 20-page PDF. This is an opportunity to really go talk to the actual person, and look at this from a program perspective about this is what we have, this is what we're trying to do, this is our path, this is what we want to do. What can we be doing here? I never want to say, hey, what should we do? Because I always joke, I say there's two things the FDA doesn't care about. They don't care about your time, and they don't care about your money. So if you say, should we do this? They'll say, yeah, sounds great. Go ahead and do it. So, not what we should do, but how can we do this? How can we get this? What's our path here? And really get that direct discussion and feedback, I think could be truly, truly monumental for certain programs, and really helping to, again, the whole goal of the grant and the program is to support pediatric devices, because there are so few devices that are truly labeled for pediatric indication. And the fact that you can go meet with the chief of pediatrics and say, look, this is what we're doing. Here's what we got. We want to get it to market because we think it'll help kids. That's, at the end of the day, that's all we're trying to do. We think it's in the patient's best interest. We think it'll help them. Let's figure out a path forward. And I think that can be that'll be a big win for these programs.
Awesome. Kevin, thanks so much for doing this. We're 57 minutes in, which is just, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to host a number of podcasts on the Project MedTech platform, and there's certain topics that have the potential to be a bit dry and regulatory
affairs might be. Yeah,
it falls into it. But I will say, this has been an awesome discussion. There has been just, again, from doing so many of these, so much great information that you shared that as a company listening in that says, hey, I want to learn more about how I can bring a device to market in the PED space, I would recommend this discussion and listening to this. That there were just so many big picture items that you kind of took and intersected and then also explained, which is not easy to do in a complex area like regulatory. Now, there's a lot more to touch on in each one of these areas, but just awesome job. Thank you so much for sharing your background, your knowledge, the information on this space. It was super helpful. And for those who listened in, thanks for joining us. And also we'll see you on May 14th for the next webinar. Again, I'll drop the website for MPDC in the comments here. So go there, check it out. Then you'll be updated on all the information. I think previously McKay had dropped a link for the newsletter as well. Great way to stay up to date. Follow them on LinkedIn, follow them on YouTube. And then hopefully we'll see everyone on July 9th in Cleveland. So Kevin, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was great.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.